Tonight's story is The Sea of Time and Stars. Who's it by? Yeah, Mara Amberley, and it's in the Mermaidia Anthology, a whole book of mermaid stories and stuff. It's time travel, sci-fi, mermaids, all kinds of. An unspoken threat had hung over my head for as long as I could remember, and it shaped me as a person. I didn't believe I had reason to fear it because I was a good, law-abiding man. The Karathi Empire's application of justice had always been swift and decisive. You might even call it cruel. But it had worked reasonably well as a crime deterrent for hundreds of years, with little opposition. I mean, after all, it was generally known that humanity was weak and without control, and there would be chaos. I'd once believed it, but many things had changed now. There was nothing like a jail cell to open your eyes to the real truth. I was going to experience the only sentence for serious crime firsthand. No, they weren't going to kill me. Well, at least not directly. They were far more creative and cruel than that. As I sat there trapped in the hold of a starship, boxed in by a blue force field 7 feet in diameter, you might have forgiven me for feeling sorry for myself. I didn't choose a life of crime. Not that most people would care or believe me. The Empire was taking me away from everyone and everything I knew and loved because they believed I deserved it. I didn't tell anyone, even say it out loud, but the truth was I'd make the same choices over again. I would. I'd had no choice but to act just as I did. The court would have seen my lack of remorse as a sign of guilt and sin beyond redemption, at least according to my lawyer. My sacrifice was for something greater, so my daughter might live. My true punishment was not knowing her fate and the reality that I'd likely never find out what happened to her. But giving her a chance she wouldn't otherwise have had, well, that was worth dying for. My senses had all but drowned out in the distant roar of the ship's engines. There were other prisoners in this section, but I couldn't see them from my cell. They called out at all hours, made a racket, but I already knew they wouldn't do us any good. I'd seen them when I first led them in. Men with bearded faces, dirty, ragged clothes. My clothes were almost pristine by comparison. But my beard had grown now. I felt like there were eyes watching me, but I saw no one. There were probably well-hidden cameras, though. The others' conversations were a welcome distraction at times. I didn't talk to them much, but I usually listened, and I learned what I could from them and what they did. Listening helped me keep my mind from seeking out the darker places it wanted to go now. Even if all of this was for nothing, I'd still have tried because I had to do what I could for my daughter, Jade. Jade was 17 and lovely, and, well, I hope she was still alive. I paced my cell in the limited space they'd given me. I'd never been good at sitting still, especially while anxious. But by this point, I knew the corridor outside and the packing crates piled up in perfect detail. I avoided the back left corner of my cell because it was the closest thing I had to a toilet. I didn't like sitting on the bunk either. I'd spent too many hours on there, and the cold, hard metal made my back ache. It was about as bad as it sounded. Someone shouted from a cell nearby, "Guards, please! We're starving in here! You can't leave us like this!" I didn't know what the man in there. He sounded younger than my 45 years. I wondered what he'd done to wind up on the ship with me. He could have had something to do with the same heist I was arrested for. "It's been days since we ate," the man exclaimed out now. It was true. Though we were given a constant source of water through a tube in the ceiling, I took that to mean someone mustn't. I guess they didn't want us dead yet. Anyway, I'd also learned to expect some casual brutality from them, which is why I stayed silent. "Shut up, man. Don't call them," another voice begged. I recognized it as belonging to one of the men who talked a lot. I knew his crime was murder because I'd overheard him talking about it. I knew he, at least, was guilty. A door opened somewhere out of my sight, with the only clang of metal and my fuzzy memories acknowledging its presence. I expected the screams and shouts of a beating, but this was different. 2 armed guards in navy blue jumpsuits approached my force field, and I wondered if it was time. They didn't have any food with them. One guard keyed in a code on the wall panel, and a small section opened in the force field. Unfortunately, it wasn't big enough to get through. It would have been marvelous to have an opportunity to escape that hellhole. "Put your hands through it. If you try anything, you'll be shot," the second guard instructed. He aimed a laser rifle at me. Maybe he realized ideas were all I had left, but there was little to know of, no hope of success if I tried to carry them out. Would it be worse to be shot? Would I have an answer to the question that plagued me if I was? I did as I was told, while wondering what would happen if they closed the force field with my hands in it. I didn't bear thinking about it. And soon it became clear that it was not their intention. The second guard cuffed my wrist, and then the entire force field was deactivated. I felt a cool rush of fresher air and breathed in deeply as the guards screwed up their noses. Under different circumstances, I might have apologized, but their crew were the ones that put me in there in the first place. It shouldn't have been how a human being was treated, but then it was made abundantly clear to me that I wasn't a citizen anymore, and that meant I had no place in the Empire. Time to go, the first guard said. I noticed a flash of compassion in his eyes. It was rare to find a good man there, of all places. Most were cruel or indifferent. I wondered if he'd stay that way or if he'd become just like the others. Sadly, it seemed more likely than not that he'd change. I was led from my cell and past those of several other prisoners. The destined eyes watched me from behind the blue glow of their force fields. They reminded me of caged animals, and I wondered if I also looked scraggly and devoid of hope. My hair wasn't as matted as my prison garb was stained, but I suspected my eyes held the same haunted look. I craved a hot shower, but soon it might not matter. The distant roar of the engine quieted. There were no windows to see through, not here. I was led out into the corridor, one guard beside me and one behind me with his rifle aimed at my back. There wasn't much to see other than the faces of stunned crew members who recoiled as I passed. It reminded me of how I used to be. Though I was never military, I knew after what I'd been through that I would have had more compassion except towards the criminals who'd put me there. I had worked in a museum called the Stellar Museum of History. It was why I was in the right place to be manipulated and blackmailed, and with my prosecution, how I'd come to be on this ship. I'd heard the guards talking. The prison ship was called the Demeter. I'd yet to figure out if its name was apt or not, but then mythology was never my strong suit. Unfortunately, a chance to study it more wouldn't come again. More than once I'd imagined seeing the bridge, but they didn't take prisoners to anyone as illustrious as the captain. Several junior officers in uniform joined the guards, leading me into the cargo bay where a row of escape pods were positioned at intervals along the wall. A lone window provided me a view outside. Space, dark and mysterious, awaited me. I imagined it was like death, a place to lose oneself forever and perhaps find peace. As I inched closer, I could see it looked out over a planet below, or maybe a moon. Dorfus 5, one of the guards explained. The other admired the view. One of the officers stepped forward. I recognized him as a major from his stripes. He was young, no older than 23, 24, I'd guess. I wondered how he managed to rise in the ranks so quickly. Cole Zoran, you have been found guilty of grand theft by the Court of Leiades. You will be sentenced to exile on the rim world of Dorfus 5. In order to ensure your punishment is permanent and assistance impossible, you will be deposited on the surface in the year 416, which is over 10,000 years in the past. There you will find no hope of rescue and no other human souls. It is the hope of the court that it will give you time to reflect on your misdeeds for the remainder of your life. With a sigh, I nodded, just wanting to get it over with. I'd heard things about the surface of Dorfus 5 and the other planets they used as penal colonies. They were wild, untamed, filled with dangerous animal and plant life, rugged terrain, in some cases barely enough water to survive if you could find it. I knew a harsh life likely awaited me there, one where I would never see those I loved again, and then there was yet one more threat. As written in the charter, the junior flight officer on the crew has the right to fire on your pod up to 3 times while you descend, should they choose to do so. For this reason, your pod has limited directional capabilities. You may attempt to avoid these shots, but know this may cause you to land in a less favorable area. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Everyone else there, the officers, the guards, sported severe, stoic expressions. Not me, despite what I faced. Perhaps I knew if I didn't laugh, then I'd go crazy, or maybe it was the absurdity of it all. I shook my head. I noticed one good-natured glimmer in the eyes of the friendly guard. I couldn't have said how it helped, but it did. Do you have any final words, Cole Zoran? Another officer asked. He was an older man with an overly stiff posture. Well, I don't suppose it would help now, but just so you know, I'm innocent on all charges. I only did what I had to so I could save my daughter. We know what happened, the same officer replied. I was dumbfounded. I'd been found guilty by the court despite the complexity of events. And it doesn't change what we're here to do. I am sorry. I nodded at that, surprised. Is there any word on my daughter? They exchanged glances, and several of the men shook their heads. There's no point in asking them to check. They weren't just a massive distance from the central planets. They were likely already at least 10,000 years out of time. And sadly, so was I. Well, then please, if you can do so one day, tell her that my thoughts were with her and would be for the rest of my life. The same officer nodded, and I knew she would receive a message if she could. Remove his cuffs. Prepare for the descent, the major ordered. The pod was small. Too small even for a couple of droids. It hardly gave me enough room to move or breathe. It reminded me of a metal coffin signaling the death of my old life. I figured the Karathi Empire intentionally made it as intimidating as possible. Given they were about to drop me into the atmosphere of an alien planet, I thought it safe to say they succeeded. I spent a lot of time thinking about that moment before they dropped me. But I didn't feel any urge to hold on to my last contact with humankind. I felt numb more than any other emotion, as though my mind was shielding me from the worst of my current reality. I was resolved, and I accepted that if my fate was to die on the way down to the planet, then that was what would happen. I studied the controls, so if I had to evade shots from the Demeter, I at least stood a chance. At least, that was what they wanted me to think. Targeting technology was precise, and most missiles had homing capabilities. Flying out of the way might not be enough. It felt like a game was stacked against me, but then so did my life in general now. Maybe it was for now. But once I was down on the planet, things might be different. Hell, if I made it there alive. It happened fast and with little warning. One moment I was ready in my pod, and the next I was ejected from the ship at breakneck speed. My controls were limited. I registered my descent speed, but of course there was no way to slow it. There were directional controls in the form of 4 buttons and a small view screen that showed the diagram of the ship, atmosphere, my landing zone. Kind of like a Gravis gamepad with a 2.5-inch display. I hoped the understanding of the crew would be enough for them not to fire on me, but I wasn't counting on that. Some of them might be good men and women, but there was no reason to think the captain was, or the junior officer wouldn't fire on me. I waited for shots from above, unsure whether they'd show up on the view screen at all. I might miss the landing zone if I changed my trajectory, but I decided to do it anyway. Sometimes a little control was better than none. Even when the options were limited, I nudged the controls and thought I felt a change in the pod. At least if I crashed into something or landed miles from the water, the descent was partially on my terms. I couldn't imagine what it would be like never seeing another person again. But really, it might not be that terrible. I'd missed my family and those who had once been friends, but compared to life controlled by prison guards, it seemed a better option. The pod shook from the turbulence and soon heated to a barely tolerable level. Even with its protective shielding, the sides of the pod were burning me, so I pulled in tighter. Changing the pod's direction again, I saw my adjustments on the screen, and then the intended landing area blinked out of existence. Bastards. I had no idea whether they'd fire on me. I tensed as my pod landed. The rough landing threw me backwards painfully. Thankfully, there wasn't far I could go. I pulled the door lever the moment I was sure I was no longer moving. The 2 sides of the pod separated and water rushed in. I managed 2 breaths before the pod filled with water. There was no belt to hold me in place, so I swam out through the opening of the pod and up towards the surface. I was shocked to realize that my pod's landing had been on water. It would have been so much worse on land, and I wasn't sure I'd survived it. I swam for a good 20 seconds before surfacing, and as beautiful as the view was beneath the water, it wasn't at the forefront of my mind. Surviving was. I'd been led to believe this planet was rough, rugged, dangerous. Maybe it was. But I was met with a view of the most beautiful, perfect blue sky and a smattering of clouds. There were no longer views like this on the central planets. They were almost entirely consumed by cities with space given to well-tended gardens here and there. No, this was something else. Pristine nature. I didn't quite know what to make of it, but Jade would have loved it. A seemingly endless ocean stretched out to my left, but to my right was a distant shore with vivid green trees. It wasn't far, thankfully, so I swam toward it. A seldom used skill from my youth. I wasn't an especially strong swimmer, but I wouldn't have managed without it. Beneath the water and plants were plants and coral in different colors, green, orange, yellow, while small alien fish darted through the water. They seemed to ignore me. And I did the same thing, looking above the water as I swam. It rippled around, the perfect, clear water reflecting the sky. It was like heaven, but I knew there'd be no leaving the planet. My landing pod was heavy and was unlikely I could salvage it. The electronics would also probably be fried from the water. It likely wouldn't have done any good anyway. They were built to descend into a planet's atmosphere, and their journey ended there. If this was to be my prison, well, frankly, it seemed better than I'd ever envisaged. My fears had created a lot of worse possibilities. I let the salty water wash over me. I needed to find a fresh water source once I reached land. As the moments passed and I swam closer, I noticed shapes in the distance beyond the tree line. They were so large it was a wonder I didn't see them first. More geometric than mountains or hills, they towered up into the sky, large black pillars of stone. I felt something brush against my leg, and I noticed it was a plant. They were dark green and so long and soft they moved with the ebb and flow of the water. I moved through them as quickly and carefully as I could, and then I felt something brush against my arm. It felt different than the plant. Maybe it was a fish. The plants grew more sparse. The shore wasn't far away now. I could see the beach in more detail, and blue vines hung from the distant trees. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. I took another breath, and then I felt a sharp sting as something slashed across my leg. It felt just like someone had taken a knife to me, and when I grabbed my leg, there was a hole right through my prison slacks. I was bleeding. I looked around, but there was no sign of the source. I swam for land as fast as I could. My blood might attract predators, and I didn't want them cutting my exile short. Something else darted by. A dark flash through the water as something slashed the sleeve of my shirt open. More blood spilled, and I refused the temptation to grasp my wound because it would slow me down. I swam as I'd never swum before, fast and as though my life depended on it, because it probably did. Another cut caught me across the side of my neck, and that made me realize it had probably gone for my jugular. I saw another flash, and I knew it was a fish of some kind. It wasn't one of the small ones I'd seen earlier. It was large and with a yellow stripe at the bottom. I was close to the island now, no more than 30 meters. Two more caught me across the ankles and another across my back. There was more than one fish. Could they be working together, or had I swum into a school of them? My wounds stung as I forced my way through the water, flailing. I felt something wrap around my legs. Something had me. A creature of some kind? No, more of those weeds. But I stopped, and the fish were slashing me, my shoulder, my back, my throat. Oh, my God. I wasn't going to make it. How could I not make it? The beach was right ahead of me. Panic took hold, but I felt myself fading. Could there be venom? My mind was slipping away, and I was losing all grasp of myself. I was going to die there, and I couldn't let that happen. But I didn't know how to stop it. I kept fighting and swimming, pawing uselessly at the water as I felt myself go under. And then there was darkness. The end. I told you it was a short one tonight. No, not really. I woke with a shudder, the sand cold and rough under my back. I glanced around. Fear, a sour taste in the back of my throat. I was on the island near the tree line, the pain all over my body making it clear I was alive. My mind was foggy, and it took me a minute to question how it was even possible that I'd survived. Perhaps a wave had washed me up on the shore, but then I remembered nothing after going under. After rolling onto my side, I lay there in the sand for at least a few minutes as I caught my breath. I ran a hand over my sleeve, sliced in several places as though someone had taken a sword to it and me. My trouser legs were the same, the many cuts shallower and coated with oil and fine sand. I looked up and down the beach, confirming I was alone. I'd been told I would be the only human on this world in this time frame, but my survival gave me a reason to wonder. I sat up, wincing because it hurt. A shiver ran up my spine, and it wasn't from the cold water. I had avoided death, but I didn't know how I'd done it. Well, maybe I should just have counted my lucky stars. I rested for as long as I could justify and glanced out over the waves. I enjoyed the view on this strange alien world. It seemed my imagination, but I thought I saw shapes moving among the waves. Maybe it was the plants, or the fish that had attacked me. I was ready to turn back toward the trees when I noticed a pair of eyes gazing at me. A woman watched from just above the waterline, her sleek blue hair drifting in the water around her. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. So quickly I could have put it down to my imagination or a hallucination from my injuries, but I was sure in that moment that I was not alone. Whoever she was, she didn't seem to fear the deadly fish. Maybe they feared her, which made me wonder if I should too. I wanted to follow her, but there was no way I was going back into the water at that time. The turquoise waves hid many secrets, and she was one of them, because I didn't see anything more of her. Once I climbed painfully to my feet, I started up toward the beach, toward the trees. They were a vivid, unnatural green, draped with blue vines. I had no idea what I could safely eat or drink on that island, but I hadn't eaten in days, and I was literally starving. I acted with as much care as I could, but the food, water, and shelter were my immediate priorities. It occurred to me that I couldn't be more than 20 miles from the pod's original landing site. That meant resources might be readily available in the area if they had not intended me to die. They really seemed to be doing their utmost to damn me in every way possible, and curiously enough, it wasn't working. Maybe the fates had better plans for me yet, or maybe I was just too stubborn to die. As I approached the trees, I realized that the source of the blue color on the vines was a multitude of tiny flowers. Their subtle perfume drew me, but I felt something wasn't right. They looked like the perfect lure. Maybe the vines wrapped around unwary prey that ventured too close. I picked up a small rock and tossed it toward one of the trees a good distance away. Nothing happened as it bounced harmlessly to the ground. Maybe it wasn't dangerous, but I remained cautious. It was one thing that probably wouldn't try to kill me later. The structures I noticed from the water seemed to be jagged black towers or monoliths of stone and not buildings of any kind. They were far enough away that I couldn't see them in a lot of detail, but they were not skyscrapers. They looked more like crystal stalagmites that grew well above the canopy of the tallest trees. I decided I'd have to investigate them later, but they weren't the priority. I kept the ocean at my back as I wandered through the alien forest. The last thing I wanted was to get lost. The terrain was soft and sandy for the most part, with gently sloping hills and small rocks scattered across the landscape. There were wild grasses and some trees with firmer branches that appeared less alien and felt safer to be around. I picked up a large fallen branch and snapped off the twigs. It wasn't much, but it would serve as a walking staff and a weapon if I needed one. I had no idea what was out there yet. I just knew what I needed to find. I stumbled across the ruins of an old shack, though not much of it remained. There were still timber supports, which had slumped toward the ground with age. Woven panels had almost entirely rotted away. They weren't useful for shelter, but I could tell the builder had once used some of the wider grasses that grew in abundance on the island. The shack probably had belonged to another prisoner. They might even have been from Demeter if they'd been sent back further in time than me. Rummaging around the ruins of the shack, I found an old clay pot, an oddly shaped bottle with a spongy cork on the top. The bottle was incredibly light, and it took me a moment to realize it was made from a seashell. The outside was flaking with age, but it seemed sturdy enough to hold water. It was a lucky find, because it meant if I could find a source of plain water, I could carry some with me. I knew that if I built a shack, I'd keep it near a water source, provided it was safe to do so. Animals were normally attracted to water too, though I really hoped I wouldn't run into any, prelingual monkeys throwing bones in the air, worshipping great monoliths or something. Honestly, I wasn't sure what lived on this planet. After searching through the ruins of the shack, I decided it was time to leave. The day wasn't getting any younger, and I was growing thirstier all the time. It was an afterthought, but there was some difference in vegetation that grew around the shack compared to the nearby woods. It made me wonder if the original owner might have grown plants nearby that were safe to eat. It was risky trying them, but I needed food. Fishing was always an option, but I also knew the fish in these parts, had a bite of their own. There were bunches of plants with red leaves growing near the shack's rotted panels, so I tore a leaf off one. It reminded me of something I'd heard once before, that red things were often dangerous. Spiders sprang to mind, and some plants, but there were others that were safe, like beetroot and red onions. I swallowed it down anyway. It didn't taste bad. It was like lettuce, only drier. I didn't feel ill after eating it, so I grabbed a few more handfuls and set back into the woods. The day was growing warmer, or maybe it was just me from all the walking, and I realized I had no idea what to expect of this planet. The days could be longer than I was used to, or the temperatures could drop at night. I had no idea about storms in the region, but for the moment the weather was clear. The cuts on my body still stung, especially as I worked up a sweat and my clothes rubbed against them, but I kept on going. I wanted to get as much done as I could while I still had the strength. The minutes turned into hours, and I eventually found a narrow stream several handspans across that flowed down toward the sea. The water didn't taste of salt, and I resisted the urge to gulp it down in case it was harmful in some way. I tried a little at first, then allowed some time to pass before drinking more. It was cool and refreshing, and I felt so much better for it. I took the opportunity to clean my wounds and splashed cold water on my face. I had the bottle from the shack, so I assumed the previous owner was no longer around, but I was open to the possibility that they were. An hour or so later, I searched for a safe place to sleep as the sky was darkening. I was exhausted from my walking and still recovering from my injuries. As tempted as I was to return to the beach, it felt far too far away. I found a place between two large rocks that provided cover. There was likely wildlife I had not yet encountered. I pulled off my shirt and I slept on it in the grass. It was the most comfortable, but I wasn't the most comfortable. It would do until I found something better. When I woke, I was met with another sunrise. I didn't think I'd slept that long, but when I searched the sky, I found a second sun. My wounds were no longer stinging as they had been before. It could have been the substance I'd found on my wounds, or washing them with water that might have helped. It was hard to say for sure. I took a swig from the water and bottled, and in my hunger ate more of the red leaves. They hadn't killed me yet, or even sickened me, so I assumed for the time they were safe. It would have taken more than I had to make a significant dent in my hunger, but for the moment it was enough to keep me going. My thoughts returned to the sea. Not only the useless life pod which lay somewhere beneath those waves, but to the fish that attacked me, the mysterious feminine eyes that I'd seen watching me. I was sure it wasn't my imagination, though I hadn't been in the best shape at the time. I accepted that I might be the only human being alive on Dorfus 5, but I wondered who or what else might be there. I already sensed this was a world full of secrets, or at least mysteries. I walked for what felt like hours. It couldn't have been more than an hour or two at the most. The sight of the waves was calming, despite the dangers that lurked beneath them. I'd already decided I would try fishing, though I didn't know which ones were safe. A fishing line was out of the question for the moment. A spear was an option, but I was reluctant to wander out there very far. I spied some rocks in the distance, and I found a sharp stick I could use as I made my way toward it. I set down my staff for the time being. There were weathered boulders scattered along the shore. Some were larger and further out in the water than the others, but I could climb on one and fish from there, so the large attack fish wouldn't have much opportunity to savage my legs. I carefully waded through the water. It lapped at my ankles at first, deepening by the time I reached the boulder I decided upon. It was covered with pale blue lichen that seemed strange, but not out of place. I climbed up easily. As I looked out over the water, I saw some small fish darting about. I didn't think they were the kind that had attacked me before, but it would have taken a lot of them to equal a meal. The first time I spotted a large fish nearby, I stabbed the spear into the water. It was far too quick, and the spear lacked power, and the fish darted away before I could try again. I made several more frustrating attempts at fishing before I noticed soft laughter nearby. Either I was losing my mind, which was entirely possible, or I was not alone. I turned to see a woman in the water. I could only make out her head and shoulders, and she was smiling. It wasn't a sight I would soon forget. Her hair was the softest iridescent blue, and it covered her shoulders, sticking to them amidst the gentle waves. I was sure it was the woman I'd seen before. You want to be careful out there, I told her. The fish here can attack. I didn't want to see her harmed. Still, it felt like an odd thing to say, because she seemed so at ease in the ocean. She likely knew the planet far better than I did. I didn't know how she was there or why her hair was blue. She was obviously a strong swimmer, but something was different about her beyond the obvious. I hadn't yet put the pieces together. You speak, she said, steadying me with her pale green eyes. I felt like they could see right through me and into my soul. Then again, it might have been that I just found her attractive. I didn't think you would, she explained in a strange, lilting tone. The fish are ours. They protect us from dangers. It occurred to me then that I must have still had my translation implant, and it was working. I thought it had been removed along with my other enhancements, but if it helped me and this lovely lady understand one another, then it was a good thing. Why don't you come closer? She suggested, beckoning to me. She swirled the water with her hand, and my gaze was drawn to her gesture. Well, if it's all the same, I think I'd like to stay closer to the shore for now. You are wise. It clearly wasn't the answer she wanted, but I didn't want to offend my newfound friend. She didn't make any move to swim closer, so I took a chance and climbed down over the side of the boulder. Would you be more comfortable on land? I asked. I glanced at her meaningfully. Oh, I cannot go up there, she said matter-of-factly. I have no feet. What? I asked, confused. I wasn't ready to accept this lovely young lady was a double amputee. As if to provide clarification, she dived under the water, and I saw a momentary flash of a dark green tail. It was not what I was expecting. Well, that's different, I exclaimed as I scratched my head, wondering how such a thing was possible. I'd heard old legends of sea folk, but most people didn't believe in them. Of course, the Empire had established a new frontier of alien worlds, so many things were possible there that hadn't been back home. Home. Hell, wasn't even that anymore. She didn't surface again, and I searched the ocean for further signs of her presence. I couldn't find her, but I heard a voice that was much younger. The first mermaid was in her late 20s, perhaps, or would have been if she was human. This one was no older than 9 or 10, and she wore a top of green scales. You don't want to trust her, the girl told me. She's mean. She controls the fish, but if you upset her, she'll let them attack you. My mother stays away from her. You should, too. Thank you, I said, taking her warning to heart. I considered retreating to the boulder, but didn't just yet. Where did you come from? I've been watching from over there, she said, pointing at another of the rocks further out in the water. We live in caves, but I like to swim around the island. Caves? I asked cluelessly. To be fair, I hadn't been on the island for all that long. Underneath the dirt, she said, pointing down toward the sand. I nodded, finally understanding. I hadn't noticed any when I first arrived, but they were probably more accessible from other parts of the island. They're all underwater? I asked, wanting to learn about what I could about the environment here. Not all of them. It made me wonder how much I didn't yet know about this island. How many of you are there? I asked, figuring I should gather what intel I could. The young girl seemed quite happy to talk to me. Oh, there are lots of us, and more further away. I see, I said, wondering how many there were. Hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions. I could have asked, but I figured it might be better not to for now. Besides, it was not immediately relevant. So your people can't walk on land? I asked. I'll admit part of my reason for asking was so I would feel safer knowing I had a place to retreat if it was necessary. The girl was friendly, but other mer people might not be. No, not at all, the girl replied. What's your name? My name's Cole. Cole Zoran, a name I'd never expected to speak nor hear again. I'm Aquiera, she said, dipping under the water before bouncing up again. Aquiera, that's a lovely name. What's the other lady's name? Salia, she said, screwing up her face. How'd you get here? She asked as she splashed around. Well, my ship crashed. I knew it was only a partial explanation, but I was reluctant to say too much just yet. Was it small? I nodded. Yes, it was. Did you see it? No, but others have come here before, a long time ago. People who weren't wanted anymore. Is that why you're here? I thought hard about how I should answer the question. All of those who had been dumped on the planet were prisoners, and they might not have made the best impression. I didn't want their behavior to reflect on me, but I didn't want to lie either. Well, there might be someone back home who still wants me, but I don't know if she died. Oh, that's sad, the little girl replied. What happened? Some bad men took her, made me do things I didn't want to do. I did and got in trouble, but I don't know if they let her go. Can't you find out? Not anymore. I'm here and there's no way to find out. I'm stuck here with no way to get home. She thought about it for a long time before she replied. You could try the shamaness. She can't help you leave, but she ought to be able to show you the truth. I envisioned an elderly soothsayer, but the truth was I didn't know for sure what to expect or whether she could help me. Obviously, I wanted to find out the answer. My worry for my daughter was consuming, but I also didn't know who I could trust. Well, how would I see the shamaness? Would she see me? You'd have to swim down to see her, the girl replied. She doesn't leave her cave. Is there any part of it that's not submerged? I asked, wondering if there's any real possibility of getting an answer. I didn't want to get my hopes up if they'd only be crushed. Well, some isn't, Aquiera replied. I saw it once, and some of her cave has lain without the water. Can you show me now? I asked. I wasn't feeling the best. still covered in fish slashes, but I needed to know the truth. If the need to swim too deep was a problem, I knew I'd find out soon enough. "Oh, that would be a bad idea," she said. "I will ask and come back this time tomorrow to give you the shamaness's answer and her price. She always has one." I sighed when the girl spoke of a price. I'd almost nothing to my name. Perhaps in time, if I would if she asked for something attainable. "Well, I'll be here," I promised, as I made my way back through the water toward the beach. There was little I could do for now except recuperate. My fishing skills obviously left a lot to be desired. It occurred to me that I could ask the mermaid to catch a fish for me, but when I turned around, she was already gone. It was about time I tried some more plants to find out what I could eat safely. I didn't want to starve to death, and it was up to me to ensure that didn't happen. I might not be much of a fisherman, but there were wild grasses in abundance. Perhaps I could weave a net or trade with mer people. They likely had a lot of things. After some more rest, a meal of leaves, some berry-like fruits I'd found in fresh water, I felt more decent than I'd had since landing on Dorfus 5. I'd made inroads into creating a net, but it would take some time. So I left it to sit a while I set about exploring more of the island. I didn't want to go so far away that I couldn't make it back in time for my meeting with Aquiera. But the days were long on the planet, and I needed to know more about my new home. I knew the crystal monolith could serve as landmarks, so I could gauge my direction and distance. And as of yet, I hadn't seen the monkeys gathered about them, chanting and stuff, so I figured it was okay. And I considered following the coast along, but I needed to know what else was on the island and how safe it was. I couldn't tell which direction was which, but if I viewed the second sun as moving in a westerly direction, then I traveled toward the east. That put the monolith to the north, or at least my perception of what north should be. The low grasses gave way to sparse trees and then a deeper forest. They weren't like the alien trees I discovered near the beach or even those close to the stream. These were woodier rather than succulent, and I noticed movement among the branches. I thought I'd spotted birds, but as I got closer, I realized they were different. They seemed more like bats or the pterodactyls of ancient times. I'd never seen either firsthand, only in books. But there were notable differences and similarities. They were more leathery than feathered. I wondered if they might be edible and hoped they didn't think the same of me. They didn't seem big enough to do me any harm, so I ventured further into the woods until I encountered what I could only be compared to a massive gash in the landscape. It took me a moment to realize what it was. A shot had been fired from the ship and struck the ground. I climbed down to the crater and ran my fingers through the charred sand. This was recent. A chill ran down my spine as I climbed out and backed up against the nearest of the large trees. The island felt far safer than when I was around my own people, and I didn't like how I felt about that. Some of the ship's crew knew the truth of what happened to me, and yet this had been allowed to happen, and they called me a criminal. I considered returning to the remains of the shack. It seemed early as the second sun was high in the sky, but I was tired from my walk and the ordeal I'd been through. Then there was the stress, because I didn't know what I might encounter that could be dangerous for me. I hadn't seen any land animals other than the alien bats since arriving, not even ants, and I wasn't sure what to make of that. A far larger bird in the distance drove me into the trees, and then I just kept on walking until the forest ended abruptly. I stood before a cliff, looking out over the water. It was a long way down, but the cliff was rocky, and I thought there might be a way. I squinted, but no matter how much I tried, the view didn't look quite right. If it had just been the ocean, then that wouldn't have been so strange, but it wasn't. It was more like an optical illusion. It seemed as though I was looking at a hologram at just the right angle to find its flaws. On one side, there was the empty ocean with the waves rolling, and then there was something like a hint of rainbow and the sun shining in my eyes, only it wasn't that. Something was there, but I couldn't tell for certain what it was. On the right side, I saw boulders, not small like those strewn across the beach, but several larger ones assembled together. They were about 30 meters out from the beach, and I wondered if they formed the base of a small island or something like one. There was a hint of a wall that might have been the edge of a building, but there was few details to go on, and it seemed to blur into the light and the ocean beside it. I wasn't reckless enough to go jump into the water from the cliff top, not with all those rocks below. So I found a safe way down. It took me almost an hour to reach the beach, and I walked through the cool water to soothe my feet. I wasn't wearing shoes, and walking and climbing had taken its toll. A swig of water from the bottle cooled my throat as I studied the view from my new vantage point. It hadn't changed much, but I was sure I saw the back of a building. I wondered if there was some kind of cloaking field and if some sections of it might have failed. If it had, then there was likely more to the planet than my people knew. The only other intelligent beings on the planet I'd seen were the Mer people, so for the time being I assumed they might have something to do with it. The Karathi Empire supposedly didn't use cloaking technology anymore. It was outlawed by their treaties. I wasn't ruling out the possibility that they had a base on the planet. I knew not to underestimate them. The water between the beach and the rock seemed quiet enough, and I hadn't walked all that way for nothing. There could be defenses I didn't know about. I didn't want to risk drawing attention before I could make it across. I considered taking my staff, but I decided against it because I knew it would be awkward to swim with it. I trudged into the deeper water, taking my time as I washed around my ankles, then up to my knees. I waited to see if I was attacked, but the slashes didn't come this time. The water was almost clear. When I spotted a small rock, I picked it up and threw it as far as I could toward the island. It passed through the cloaked portion and promptly disappeared. Crazy. There was no obvious threats that warned me away, so I moved quickly. My singular goal was to cross the water as fast as possible and reach the questionable safety of the rocks. I swam with the sound of my heart beating in my ears. The salty water stung my eyes, but I barely noticed. Colorful rocks lay beneath the water, but there was no sign of the darting fish, no mermaids either, unlike here. And I breathed a sigh of relief the moment my hand touched the nearest boulder. I climbed up on top of it, dripping with water. Only then did I take another good look at my location. This is insane. I could see what I had not seen before. It wasn't just the tiny island I believed it to be. It looked at least 50, maybe 100 meters long. There was a building that towered high as an alien and beautiful thing as any I'd seen before. It was pearlescent gray and seemed to circle around like a spiral staircase or maybe a giant seashell, though I couldn't see any door to enter from where I sat. It was possible there might be one around the other side of the building. It was entirely different from the monoliths, but I planned to investigate them too. Sans monkeys. I climbed to my feet and carefully walked toward the alien structure. Without my staff, I felt vulnerable, not that it would probably have done much to protect me anyway, so I gathered up a small handful of rocks and threw one at a time ahead of me before venturing ahead. I probably looked foolish, but no one else was watching. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and I didn't want to make a potentially fatal misstep. I noticed a strange box sitting amongst the rocks. It was a perfect cube, around a meter wide, with a tan surface, weathered by the elements. It had floating hover text over it that said 1 prim. No, I made that part up. When the small rock hit the surface of that cube, the pebble all but exploded. I felt significantly less foolish after that. The message was clear. Stay away from that. Whatever it was, the owner of the tower wanted to protect it from interference. That probably made it something important. It occurred to me then that if humans or similar alien species wanted to protect their assets from a mer people, a tower would be one way to do it. The mer people couldn't reach it without walking, but then why put it so close to the water if that was the case? The island was off limits to the mer people other than the caves the young girl Aquera had told me about. I wondered if the caves might have been a secret she was meant to keep from outsiders like me. I quickly discovered the door to the tower, and it wasn't protected by a force field. I wouldn't have put it past its original owners to have some kind of scanner, but I didn't meet any resistance. I nudged the door and I walked in. There was a staircase leading up along the wall and a massive hole in the center of the floor that was not part of the original architecture. Someone had smashed their way in from the ocean below, and I was fairly sure I knew who, or rather which species, had done it. The question was why. The stairs were still stable, so I began to climb. I'd run out of pebbles, and I was paranoid there was some kind of trick step, but if so, I didn't trigger it. It was strange. The way the building grew narrower and higher, I climbed. It must have been close to the top, and I climbed a lot of stairs before it opened into a small room. I knew at once I'd likely found my new home on the island. It was well protected, well hidden from some threats, though I wasn't certain where the nearest fresh water or edible plants could come from, so those were still wrinkles to iron out. The room had many monitor-like screens, over 10 of them. A pillar on the center of the room was marked with grooves and indentations. My instincts told me it was some kind of data core, but I wasn't sure because the pillar's technology was unfamiliar to me. There was a broken chair and some rubble from one of the walls, but the room was not exposed to the elements at all. I was certain it was some kind of observation post that the original inhabitants had left behind, whether willingly or not. Some of the screens were blank, as though the cameras feeding them images had been destroyed, but others were still operational. Two were looking down on the island from high above, and I realized then that they must have been positioned at or near the top of the monoliths. The others looked to be underwater, and one of them I saw something quite unlike anything I'd seen before. It looked like an underwater city. There were clusters of buildings, dozens of them, and so strange as it might sound, it seemed they were encompassed by a phosphorescent web with many breaks in its surface. I could see the glitter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of distant lights and figures swimming through the web between the buildings. "So that's where you are," I murmured as I took a step nearer the screen. I reached out my hand and tentatively touched it, and I responded by zooming in further. There was a dark shadow above, and I soon realized it was land. If I found the entrance to the caves, they might lead down to the same city. No wonder they're patrolling the waters around the island. They lived beneath it. It was a reason to become more reclusive, but I also knew I wanted to start off on the right foot with them. What was more, they understood this world and its politics, past and present. As a visitor to the tower, especially if I lived in it, I could be very easily associated with the aliens who inhabited it before. I didn't know if they were still on the planet or if they might come back, but it seemed they'd been gone for a long time. The other monitors showed different locations. One camera was positioned in a cave entrance, and from there I had a good view of four mermaids who were talking amongst themselves, though I couldn't hear what they were saying. They all wore scaled tops, and two had necklaces strung with seashells. One was eating sea life from larger shells in a bowl while holding it above the water. I zoomed in and took careful note of the shell's appearance, as it meant they'd probably be safe for me to eat, too. The sight reminded me of my hunger, not that my stomach had allowed me to forget, but I decided it was time to go. There was no way I would forget the location of this tower. If I was going to move in, I'd need to investigate the surrounding area to find the food and water I'd need. At least it might be a good place for fishing. It was a fair walk back to get back to the beach where I'd first encountered the mermaids, and this time I followed the shore along because I knew it would take me there eventually. I arrived with time to spare. When Aquiera arrived, I knew she would. I was surprised to see that she was not alone this time. There were 3 mermaids in the water, floating just out from shore. The young one, Aquiera, was smiling, and she gave me a wave as I waded into the water. I hadn't met the other mermaids before. The younger of the adults looked in her 20s, was quite beautiful. The older was in her 50s or maybe 60s, and, well, she was lovely too. They wore scaled tops like Aquiera's, only theirs were blue instead of green. The younger woman had plants woven through her braid and hair. I wonder if the elder mermaid might be the soothsayer Aquiera had told me about. She didn't have the look of a shamaness about her, but then I didn't really have a clue what she'd look like if I saw her. The women seemed wary of me, and the feeling was mutual. I remained vigilant because I knew the attacking fish could strike fast. I stayed close enough to the shore that I knew I should be able to make it back to land in time if I had to. Hello there, I said as I approached, instinctively showing both my hands so the mermaids knew I didn't carry any weapons. Cole Zoran, Aquiera said, remembering my name. That's right, Aquiera, I said. You stay close, daughter, the young woman said. I wondered if she might be Aquiera's mother, and her protectiveness suggested to me she probably was. Aquiera made a promise she should not have made. Only our people may visit the caves and meet with the shamaness. Oh, I see, I replied. I was deeply disappointed, and it likely showed. I wondered if they could be convinced otherwise with time, even if they wouldn't agree today. Mutual trust was not built overnight. What? Why is that? I'm not sure what happened to my daughter, I explained. I believe she might be alive, but I can't return home to find out for sure. I am sorry, but we can't help you with that, the elder mermaid replied. You see, your fate is not part of the great sea the same way ours is and cannot be divined. It is best you forget about it and go on with your life. I thought before replying because I was trying to make a good impression and not show the depth of my disappointment. As it was, I wasn't sure I believed in the mermaid's ability to read my destiny or my fate. It was a long shot, but I thought I might have another way, one they might not like or know about. The other reason I've come to meet with you is because I live here now, and there's no way for me to return home to my world. I want to form a peaceful relationship with your people so there are no misunderstandings. That is a worthy goal, the older mermaid replied as she studied me. The strength of her stare was so intense I glanced away. But I'm sorry, since it's now 8 p.m., this story is over and there can be no peace treaty. Good night. Now, let's continue the story. We only got a few minutes left. I think we can do it. Generally, and usually, the visitors who have come to live in our world have not always behaved well, but their hearts were usually good. It's written in the records of our people. I nodded, wondering what other information the mer people had about them. Could there have been more innocent people imprisoned or exiled by the Karothi Empire than I realized? Perhaps they weren't villains, but victims of circumstance. Well, what can you tell me about the ones who created the tower, the monoliths? I thought that was the right word. I wasn't sure that they were created by the same people, but it seemed likely. Oh, you found it then. We began as the same race, and then we split, she said, drawing her hands apart. We turned to the ocean. They returned to their home, to their planet. It was called Avas. It was a name I'd heard before, though I couldn't place where. One of the planets of the old Republic, I thought. They had feet and you have tails? How did that come about? I gave her a sheepish smile, wondering if I was intruding on a hidden secret my question might cause offense. You ask bold questions, Colzoran. They changed the pattern and made us on the loom. From then on, we were. It seemed to me she was describing genetic engineering. It had been outlawed 2 centuries ago by the Karothi Empire, and it was rumored the experiment still went on. I sensed they were waiting for an answer from me, and I replied, I see. So you have no way to return to your ancestral home. I was living in hope. No, but we communicate, the younger woman replied, and she received a glance from the elder mermaid as though she'd said too much. Not through time, though, I uttered with a sigh. Yes, through time, she added. Time and stars matter not to a connection of the heart. Really? Could you please send a message for me? I asked her hopefully, wondering if it could somehow be passed to my own world, and more specifically to Jade, my daughter. I wondered what would happen if Jade received it before the heist that condemned me. Could she use it to save herself or change my future? I already knew changes could be made in the timeline. It was just one reason why prisoners were sent so far back in time as I had been. We cannot, but you could. Perhaps in time we'll show you how, the older woman replied. I nodded respectfully. I'd have done almost anything for that ability. It was not the immediate answer I'd sought, but it gave me more hope for Jade than just knowing her fate. Even if the mermaids refused later, perhaps there was a way to use the technology in the tower to achieve my goal. If you have no opposition, I would like to use the buildings on land, including the tower. It occurred to me as soon as I said it that I gave them too much opportunity to scupper my plans. The elder mermaid hesitated before eventually replying. The realm of land will be accessible to you, Colzoran. It is not our domain. I smiled at her, and a good part of that smile was relief. It's safe for me to fish around the island? I need to catch food. You may fish, so long as you kill none of our people. I would not think of it, I promised her. Then we are in agreement. Our discussion will be relayed to the others. Once the elder mermaid had dived beneath the water, she didn't surface again. Aquia remained with her mother. Can you tell me how things work here? I asked, meaning on the planet. Are there many other species? Are there things I must do or know that will affect how I live here? The others are gone, Aquia replied, but there are creatures in the sea. And birds in the sky, the woman added. Don't use magic in the sea. You will offend some and worry others. Magic is real? She smiled as though I'd asked something silly. Of course magic is real. I realized just how different our species were and just how much I mightn't know. After all, if mermaids were real, so much else could be. Tell me, please, what can I do to learn how to contact my daughter? It's killing me, not knowing if she's safe. Where before there had only been distrust in the mermaid's eyes, now there was more sympathy. Come back here tomorrow at second sunrise, and I will help you learn. It will not be easy for you, I think, but your connection is strong, and that's the important thing. Thank you, I said, almost entirely at a loss for words. No problem at all. And she and Aquia gave me a smile before they swam away. I sat on the beach. I looked out over the cool water with its rolling waves as a gentle breeze stirred my hair. I might not have had all the answers just yet, but it was a start, and that was far more than I expected to have. There I truly realized for the first time that my exile could be in paradise if I built a good life. I wasn't ruling out that I might leave one day if I had the chance. But for a change, time was on my side.